Hello, my name is Houston, and this is Media Mood Board. Yes, my name's Houston, and this is Media Mood Board, a weekly show about hyper-specific entertainment lists. Today's episode, we're just going to talk about what I read in March. Let's start off with The Silver Bone. If you watched my What You Should Read from the Booker Long List video, The Silver Bone was my favorite from all the ones in the long list, the one that sounded the most interesting to me. And luckily, my library ended up having just gotten a copy in after I'd done my research and made that video. So I was like, okay, I'm going to grab it. I'm going to read it. So Silver Bone is a magical realist crime novel set in 1919 Kiev. The way this town is illustrated is it's complete chaos. There's gangs of criminals and gangs of different police that are roving the streets and kind of just doing whatever they want. Everyone's got their doors locked. It's unsafe to go outside almost in any context. The opening scene of the book, we pick up midway through this attack on the main character Samson and his father by this group of crazed police officers. We see Samson's dad get stabbed to death, and then Samson gets his ear cut off. Samson lives through the fight, and he goes and grabs his ear, and it's like, okay, I'm going to hold on to this so that I can hopefully get it put back on by a doctor at some point. Now that Samson's dad's dead, he has to provide for himself, basically. He was an engineering student at a college. He gets hired by the local police department as kind of a detective, but mainly just hey, can you try and help, bring order to things here, which is an impossible task. Not long after he gets there, he starts to kind of become privy to a conspiracy that's going on, or what he sees as a conspiracy, this kind of bigger crime ring, or maybe even something going on in the police department. And he finds out about this because he overhears it from his detached ear, which he can still hear out of despite it not being attached to him anymore. I really love the atmosphere in this book. This is a Ukrainian author, and out of the Eastern European stuff that I've read, this very much feels in that same kind of literary feel. I need to think of a better word to describe that, but it just feels very literary. It all feels very well described. It feels very tactile, and you know exactly where you are. You get a real sense of it in your head of what this place looks like, what the vibe is, who these people are. The situation is just so helpless. No one's in control. It seems just crazy. It feels like some cyberpunk novels that I've read that are almost dystopian-y in the future, or in Gangs of New York, how everyone's the firefighters are fighting each other and stuff like that. That kind of vibe. It's interesting. It wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be based on the description. I thought they were going to play with the fantasy elements of it a little bit more with his ear and things like that. But that really wasn't the case. I know this is part of a series that this detective is going to go on more and more cases. So maybe that'll come into play, or we'll see more magical realist elements played in future books. But in this one, it's pretty light. So all in all, this one didn't knock me out, but I was interested to see what was happening, and I really love the idea of this kind of magical realist mixed with a genre mystery. I enjoyed my time there. I don't know if I'll read the next book in the series, but I don't regret reading this one. If you're looking for a more literary detective novel vibe, this is definitely for you. I also read The Other Valley. This one was on my books I'm looking forward to in 2024 video. It's about the same length as Silver Bone. I really am loving these 200 to 400 pagers. The Other Valley is part of one of my favorite genres, which is speculative fiction, so kind of sci-fi fantasy-ish. It takes place in a world that is just a series of towns separated by mountains. Every town to your west is an identical copy of your town, but 20 years before. And it keeps going, so 20, 40, 60, etc. And everything to the east, each town to the east, is in the future. So 20 years in the future, 40 years, 60. No one is allowed to go into the other towns unless you go through a legal process. And it's normally only for special cases to see a loved one for the last time, something like that. The story follows this really quiet schoolgirl named Odile, who actually spots some people from the future village visiting. You're not supposed to see them. They're supposed to be very incognito, and recognizes them as the parents of this boy that she has a crush on. This is my favorite new release that I've read this year, hands down. I feel like I kept telling Rosie, like, this book's really good. You should read this book. And she's like, you've really been saying that a lot about this. It almost feels like a walk to remember kind of thing, because there's this ticking clock where you know this guy that she has a crush on is going to die, and you're kind of like, can she prevent it? Can we stop? Is there some way we can alter the future? And the romance of it's really sweet. And, you know, she's kind of getting out of her shell because of this. She's like, oh, I need to get to know him, or just like ends up in his friend group. You know what I mean? It's got a little bit of like 80s coming of age vibes. All the characters feel really fleshed out and fun, and I really love the world. And it's a super fun premise, you know. It sparks my imagination, at least, but like, oh, what are all these things and their specific jobs, and they explore kind of the rules of these cities a little bit and stuff like that, which is really fun. It's kind of predictable, but that's like kind of part of the fun of it, you know what I mean? I think that the first half I enjoyed better than the second half, but it lands on its feet, and I really enjoyed the whole experience, really. Those are just minor complaints. I really felt for these characters, and I found myself really excited to get back to my book so I could read and see what happens next. Super recommend. Last month, I also finished the audiobook that I'd been listening to, Entangled Life. The last 2 months, I'd been making my way through this book, which is a pop-sci nonfiction about fungus. I know that the pitch for that is like cartoonishly nerdy, but the book is aware of that and really tries to entertain you and keep you invested in it and prove itself as something that's important to everybody, or at least should be compelling to everyone throughout the whole book. It really lands on kind of the poetic end of nature writing. One of the early anecdotes, you know, really waxing about what it means to be human, and when the boundary of you ends and another thing begins. Questions what existence is, questions what the mind is, what thought is, by viewing this kind of fungus, or these kind of weird alien creatures that are seem intelligent, and we're not exactly sure how all of it works. It got a little sloggy for me about 3/4 of the way through, but there were always cool anecdotes, and it did something really successful as a nonfiction book, I think, which is as you're reading it, you feel like you are learning eye-opening things pretty consistently throughout. Even if, you know, a little bit out from reading it, I don't remember what those epiphanies are, but while I was reading it, I felt that endorphin rush of, you know, this is really special. Wow, I can't believe that, like, not everybody knows this. The guy who reads the audiobook is also really good. I know I've read my fair share of audiobooks listened to, I guess, but a good reader can really like make or break an audiobook. I also know there's like an illustrated or like a version with photography in it that recently came out. Now that I finished this, I definitely want to see if like the library has it, or just go to Barnes & Nobles and flip through it or something, because I'm really interested in seeing what all of these creatures that I've been reading about look like. It's also worth mentioning that this book was written by a guy named Merlin Sheldrake, which is the most fantasy character name I've ever heard. So if you're into pop sci, if you like kind of like galaxy brain or like philosophical nature writing, this is a great book for you. Speaking of fantasy, I also finished Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings last month, which compared to all the other books we talked about today, this one was much more of a challenge to summarize. So The Way of Kings is the first book in cult fantasy author Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archives series. So basically, a long time ago, there was this group of knights called the Radiance. They had basically kind of like godlike powers, and they protected humanity from these demonic creatures that roamed around. Then one day, for a reason that's lost to history, they all abandoned humanity. All the Radiance did. They just left. All that's left of them are their weapons and their armor, which if you wield them, you get a modicum of their power. So you get these like kind of godlike abilities. If you're holding one of the swords or are wearing the armor, you can like go really fast. You don't take any damage, you know, like these kind of magical abilities you earn. So The Way of Kings takes place like centuries after the Radiance abandoned mankind. Once they left, it left this void, and the creatures were still attacking, and now people were now fighting each other. So it's just like constant war, constant ravaging. There's a lot of like political turmoil, things like that. So we follow a couple different characters, all in different strata of the world to give a full picture of it. We follow this enslaved soldier who's like really good with the spear. We follow this apprentice to like a magician scholar, and we follow this elder general who has some of the Radiance armor and sword, and he's recently started seeing visions of the past. There's other characters and there's more to it, but that's the general idea. And part of the question is, why are we looking at these specific characters? And as the book goes on, things start to tie together and you kind of start figuring out, okay, this is what the story is. So there's more characters and there's more stuff going on, but that's a general idea. And part of the fun with the book is, as you're following along, you start to not just follow their journeys, but start to see this wider arc of what Sanderson is trying to do with the story. Why I say that this book is difficult to summarize is it's over 1,000 pages long, and this is just the first book in the series. And as an example, a friend of mine is further along in the series, and he says several books in, there is still stuff in the prologue to this book that has not been explained multi books later. And also, it's hard to summarize because of the nature of how Brandon Sanderson writes, which is really, really cool. He's known for his world building, and the style he does, the closest thing I've ever experienced is like a FromSoft game, like an Elden Ring, like a Dark Souls, like a Bloodborne. He does not hold your hand about anything. So nothing will be explained. And as you're going through the book, offhandedly, characters will mention things that they know and everybody else knows, but you haven't learned yet. And suddenly things will start clicking into place. There are so many aha moments as you're reading this book. And it was so often that I'd be like 800 pages in and I'd read something and it's like, oh, that's what chapter 2 meant, and especially when there's connections between characters that occur and you're like, oh, okay, they were talking about that guy, and okay. And it's this really interesting world building that once you learn it, if you try to explain it, you're explaining things that, like, it's part of the fun of reading the book is these layers getting peeled back. But in trying to explain it just on a base level, you have to kind of make decisions about how much are you revealing versus if you just went in blind. Like when I was reading it, I was warned that the first 100 or so pages was slow. And it was for me. It took me a while to get into it. But because of the nature of its writing, it's rewarded for someone who rereads it, or if you already knew all the stuff going in. So I loved this. I really, really enjoyed this experience, and it took all my willpower not to jump into the next book in the series, which is also 1,000 pages. Hold on, I got it. Let me show you it for context. This is the sequel, Words of Radiance. It's only slightly longer than the first one. I read the first one on Kindle and was like, oh, I wonder how big it was. And it was huge. But anyway, I'm hooked. I'm a big fan. I'm going to read a few shorter books in between, but I am very excited to jump into it. One hard part about liking it, though, is their fan community is not very good with spoilers. You basically can't look it up online. I was spoiled about a few things in this book despite my best attempts. Even in places such as I looked up a ambient music video specifically for this book on YouTube, and in the comments there was a spoiler. I forgot a character's name, and so when I looked up a description of them, it revealed a spoiler about a completely different character in the description of that character. So the community is just basically like, hey, I can't imagine several books into this, the awareness that you have to have of how little you knew at first is I'm sure more than most people want to accommodate. And it's also cool, not just because when things converge, it gets really exciting, but because the scale of it's so big, because some of these characters have powers, or there's magic in it, of course, but the Radiance armor and swords and stuff like that can provide these abilities, it feels very like superhero anime-ish at times. Like it can move from just like this cool fantasy into like this huge like supernatural thing, which is like so fun to read. I think I've mentioned before that I haven't read too many books that have a lot of like action in them, and this book has great action. I don't have that much to compare it to, but it was super fun. And even though it's so thick, it's an easy read as far as like the language itself. It's not like, oh, what are they saying? It's very much a page turner. Anyways, talk to any Brandon Sanderson fan. They will tell you to jump on board, but I'm a new convert, and I can't wait to read Words of Radiance. So those are all the books that I read last month. I try to read at least one graphic novel each month, and last month's was Preacher #1. Preacher is this like super 90s horror Western about this preacher who gets possessed by a spirit who is the child of a demon and an angel who had a baby together. He teams up with his ex, who is a bank robber, and this kind of like hitchhiker dude who is a vampire, and they all go on a mission together to locate God, literally God, who abandoned his post after the spirit that is possessing the preacher was born. Okay, so this was a page turner. It was really exciting to read. There's a lot of cool stuff. It made me kind of like want to rewatch Trigun.
楽しかったかい？人間として生きて。ああ、最高だったと思う。
One of the people who pursues them in this is like the Saint of Killers, who's this undead saint who is an amazing gunslinger. Like the mix of magic and Western and the character designs and everything, super cool. I love the aesthetic of it, but the tone of it is not. It's a bad hang. It's the 90s. It's edgy. For instance, like one of the standout characters from it is this this guy who tried to commit suicide and failed, and now his face is all messed up, and his name is Arseface. And I also know this is a book set in the South, but there are so much homophobia in this, and I understand that that's part of the territory, but it's not fun to read. And you're kind of, when you're reading, you're like, okay, is this the character saying this, or is this the author saying this? I'm not sure. I am reading the next volume currently because it is really fun, but I am unsure if I'm good to like read the rest of the series with this tone. I just don't know how much fun that'll be. I'd compare it to like Sandman as far as like, ooh, these are interesting, cool, kind of like big concept ideas in a cool style. Sandman is not as offensive as this is, but that's kind of like what this is going for. It's on purpose, you know? But yeah, some of these things that I read to kind of wrap my head around Final Fantasy 16 a little bit, and this is one of those. It's a classic that I had never gotten around to. They made like an AMC series out of it recently. I don't think I'm interested in visiting that, but it's interesting that happened. Well, that's all that I got to last month. Was there anything that you read that you particularly liked last month? Let me know in the comments. If you liked what you saw here, you can follow Media Mood Board on letterboxd or Goodreads or just right here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back next week with another hyper-specific entertainment list. My name is Houston. This is Media Mood Board. Bye.